Once again, it's time to take a trip to 1968 and revisit some cool British singles released in November of that year. As usual, November saw the release of an insane amount of singles. Of course, this was mostly due to the fact that Christmas was around the corner, and that was always a big period when it comes to record sales. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the best singles from November. Let's begin.
Twisting metal through the air, scars and screens so you might know it's pure rain.
This single by The Pretty Things was one of the highlights of November. Both sides of the single were featured on the album SF Sorrow, which was released a month later. The B-side was also an excellent track called Balloon Burning. Unfortunately, SF Sorrow was a commercial failure when it was originally released, but it's now regarded as one of the finest and most groundbreaking psychedelic records from that period. The record predated Tommy by The Who, which was released 4 months later in March 1969, and it's widely regarded as the first rock opera. The New Musical Express wrote,
"This is a track from The Pretty Things' forthcoming album, which traces the life cycle of a man. Written by the group, it has a fascinating lyric, soloed with startling echo chanting. The guitar work behind the vocal is extremely impressive and nagging in its continual repetition of the same riff phrase. It gets a bit weird towards the end, with the sound of marching feet accompanying the reading of a roll of honor. And that's no doubt because it has been taken out of the context of the LP. Interesting and thought-provoking, but maybe a shade too way out."
Just like SF Sorrow, the single went over the heads of the record-buying public, and it inevitably failed to chart.
Going back in the morning time to see if my love has seen the light, yeah.
November 1968 also saw the release of Jethro Tull's third single. The single was released 2 months after the group issued their debut album, which became a big success and ended up reaching number 10 on the UK album charts. Record Mirror wrote,
"What with having a hit album and all that, plus a very big following round the club circuit, well, why not a hit single for this capable and inventive group? This is tough on guitar sounds, lighter on vocal line, and there's a directness about the song that I found worthwhile. It might miss, but commended."
The B-side was a track called Christmas Song.
When you're stuffing yourselves at the Christmas parties.
Love Story and Christmas Song did not appear on an album until the 1972 compilation Living in the Past, and this was Jethro Tull's last single with Mick Abrahams on guitar. The single reached number 29 on the UK singles chart and remained 8 weeks in the top 40. Blackberry Way by The Move became one of the biggest British hits from November 1968. The song was written by Roy Wood and produced by Jimmy Miller. The New Musical Express wrote,
"As I recall it, The Move's last single laid something of an egg. This one is appreciably better, though, and normally I would have no hesitation in tipping it for the chart, although I have a slight reservation right now, due to the intensive pre-Christmas competition from a host of big-name artists. All the same, I'm going to stick my neck out and vote for it. A mid-tempo number with a walloping beat and a heavy bass sound. It features a strongly projected Carl Wayne solo, backed by spirited vocal support from the other lads. There's also a very attractive and well-scored strings theme in the background."
The single became a huge hit. Blackberry Way reached number 1 in Britain, and it became a top 20 hit in 17 countries. November also saw the release of this single by The Deviants. The Deviants were led by vocalist Mick Farren, and at that point in late 1968, The Deviants had become one of the leading underground groups in Britain.
It's a long time coming, but you gotta hold on.
The group independently recorded their debut album in 1967, selling copies through the UK underground press before it was picked up by Decca Records. Certain songs from the record predated the sound of groups such as the Stooges by at least 2 years. The Melody Maker wrote,
Claimed as Britain's only true underground group, this is their first single, and it makes a splendid noise, full of wild rock and roll rhythms, taken from their second album Disposable, which seems to be the current practice among groups. The reverse side is described as a truly revolutionary item, called Let's Loot the Supermarket.
And go loot the supermarket while we got the chance.
Mick Farren, lead singer, wrote both songs, and they're mighty inventive as well. Order your copies now, or alternatively, don't order your copies now.
After the release of the Deviants' third album in October 1969, Mick Farren left the group, and the remaining members of the band formed the Pink Fairies.
Maybe tomorrow I will love again.
Prior to changing their name to Badfinger, the group was known as the Ivies. The Ivies were discovered by Beatles employee Mal Evans, and they signed with Apple in April 1968. This 45 from November was the group's debut single, and it was produced by Tony Visconti, who later in the 70s became known as the producer for artists such as David Bowie and Mark Bolan.
I'll make believe that I don't care.
The Melody Maker wrote,
Lead singer sounds like John Lennon for a bit, until they go into the harmony passage. A sad and lonely sound, well performed with tasteful string accompaniment.
The B-side was also a good song.
And a day's a millionaire.
The single failed to chart in their native Britain, but it became a top 10 hit in several European countries, achieving its highest chart position in the Netherlands, where the single rose to number 1. In the States, the record reached number 67 according to Billboard.
Billy Ray was a preacher's son, and when his daddy would visit, he'd come along.
This single by Dusty Springfield became one of the biggest hits released in November. Both sides of the single were featured on the album Dusty in Memphis, a truly excellent record which should be in everyone's record collection. The A-side became a huge international hit, and it has become a classic that has stood the test of time.
The only one who could ever teach me was the son of a preacher man, yes he was.
Disc Magazine's journalist Penny Valentine wrote,
Recorded in Memphis under the supervision of Jerry Wexler, this record is going to stun a lot of people. When I first heard it, I thought it was ideally right for the American market, where it's doing a bomb at the moment, but not really for here. That was last month. Since then, and many plays, I feel it might well reach that elusive number 1 position Dusty's waiting for. Atlantic have every reason to be pleased, and after all the ballads I've liked from her that have failed, this must be what you've been waiting for. By the way, once you've recovered, spare time to listen to Just a Little Lovin' on the B-side. It's a dream.
Just a little loving early in the morning.
Son of a Preacher Man became a huge international smash, reaching number 9 in Britain and number 10 in the States. The single became a top 10 hit in 15 countries.
Dynamic explosions in my brain shatter me across the brain.
The Crazy World of Arthur Brown scored a major hit in June 1968 when this track called Fire unexpectedly rose to number 1 in Britain and number 2 in the States. But the group never managed to replicate the success of Fire, and this track called Nightmare wasn't the hit everyone expected.
Eyes can never tell you lies. It's
The New Musical Express wrote,
This must surely be the wildest and most berserk single of 1968. Arthur's vocal become more and more fervent and demoniacal as the track progresses, almost to the point of blowing his top, while the crazy world sets up a barrage of sound, dominated by some supercharged swirling organ work that's positively phenomenal. It's a record to leave you limp with exhaustion. More than psychedelic, it's almost psychopathic. Certainly won't appeal to everyone, but those who dig it will be so fanatic about it that they're sure to boost it into the chart.
The B-side was another good track called Music Man.
roses that bleed on the street cling to the bars on my feet.
Unlike the A-side of the single, this B-side was not included on the group's debut album. Despite the huge success of the group's previous single, Nightmare stalled at number 58, and the single didn't fare much better in the States, where it only managed to reach number 107 according to Billboard. November 1968 also saw the release of the second single by Fairport Convention, and their first with lead vocalist Sandy Denny as a member of the group.
Too many friends who tried, blown off this mountain with the wind.
This was the beginning of a golden period for the band. The 3 records they issued with Sandy Denny, which were all released in 1969, are widely regarded as the peak of British folk rock. Their music was a huge influence on many bands from that era such as Led Zeppelin, and Sandy Denny ended up duetting with Robert Plant on the song The Battle of Evermore, becoming the only guest vocalist ever to appear on a Led Zeppelin record. And the Fairport Convention influence can also be heard all over Led Zeppelin 3, an album which saw Jimmy Page and company progressing towards folk and acoustic music. Meet on the Ledge was well received by the press. The Melody Maker wrote,
"A standout performance by a most underrated group, better than many American groups of the same style. It is startling that they have not received more attention. This is one for the discerning."
The A-side of the single was featured on the group's second album, but the B-side was another excellent song which wasn't featured on the record.
Come on now, mister. Step right inside and see the show.
The single peaked at number 52.
We are the moles and we stay in our holes.
When this 45 by the Moles was originally released in November 1968, many DJs and journalists believed that it was a Beatles single released under a pseudonym. Allegedly, the tape of the recording for this single was left in a train station locker and the key sent to a major English music publication with a letter stating that the tape should be released on the Parlophone label.
And the whole world is blind, we can see, the world will lose its mind trying to uncover.
Of course, this story seemed quite unlikely, and the truth was that this was a publicity stunt by manager Stephen Comlacy, who managed to fool both disc jockeys and journalists into thinking that it was recorded by the Beatles in disguise. The New Musical Express wrote,
"The publicity handout issued by EMI tells me very little about this disc or the Moles. It simply says, a very secret record, no details of composers or artists. Based upon the old rhyme about the mole who lives in his hole, it's a repetitive commercialized rhythm and blues piece with twangs galore and organ. It's a double-sided item, but the routine on the B-side is quite different from that on the plug side. I suspect a well-known group in disguise having a bit of fun in one of their less serious moments."
The record was doing quite well, picking up sales and getting airplay on Radio 1. But interest immediately waned when, according to some sources, Syd Barrett told Chris Welch from the Melody Maker that the group behind the single was Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, a band that eventually morphed into Gentle Giant in the early 70s. Despite the silliness of the publicity stunt, however, both sides of the single were actually quite good and definitely worth a spin.
She looks good to handle from a personal angle. Second generation woman, yeah.
Family are widely regarded as early pioneers of progressive rock, although their music was more psychedelic than most of the prog bands that came to define the genre in the early 70s. This was the group's third single, released just a couple of months after their first album.
Looks like a man getting higher than I can. She knows how.
The A-side was eventually featured on the group's second record later in 1969. The B-side, however, was another excellent track which wasn't featured on the LP.
Presence gone, there's only concrete to walk upon. The motorway.
The Melody Maker wrote,
Groups signed to record contracts are often expected to get hits, and Family, being in a charitable mood, have decided to lay down a heavy rock beat, doubtless hoping to appeal to those who have not seen their more esoteric live performances. An excellent group, and they make the big beat idiom quite successfully.
The single wasn't a success, but the group's first album reached a very decent number 35 on the UK album charts.
Currently at number 1, Fleetwood Mac with this beautiful instrumental number called Albatross.
Another highlight from November 1968 was this gorgeous instrumental number by Fleetwood Mac, which rose to the top of the British charts. Due to the fact that Albatross was an instrumental number, the press probably felt it had no chance of becoming a hit. And as a result, most of the major music papers didn't even bother reviewing it. According to producer Mike Vernon, the song gained traction for the first time when it was played during the end credits of a Top of the Pops segment, and the track eventually reached number 1 a couple of months later, in January 1969. According to the Beatles themselves, Albatross was the inspiration behind Sun King, which was recorded a year later and released on Abbey Road. And you can actually see the Beatles talking about the song on the Get Back documentary by Peter Jackson. As previously stated, Albatross reached number 1 in Britain. And despite the huge success of later incarnations of Fleetwood Mac, this track remains the group's only number 1 hit in the UK. Albatross was re-released in the United Kingdom in April 1973 as part of a CBS Records series entitled Hall of Fame Hits, and the song enjoyed a second UK chart run, peaking at number 2.
I'm happy to say today I'm going away to play. I'm going away to play.
According to yours truly, this B-side by a group called Timebox is one of the greatest psychedelic pop songs of 1968. The song featured a melody to die for and a truly excellent production.
God is the sad man, gone to hiding. Here is the glad man, happy and smiling.
This is one of those songs that should be remembered alongside all the big psychedelic classics from that period. But unfortunately, the song was issued as a B-side and went completely unnoticed. Timebox had achieved moderate success in 1967 with a cover of Beggin' by the Four Seasons. But this single from November 1968 was by far their greatest 45. The A-side wasn't as excellent as the B-side, but it was also a good song with a more soul-influenced type of sound.
Will you promise me that one day you'd be the love I could call mine?
The New Musical Express wrote,
I regard the Timebox as one of Britain's most underrated groups, and this single showcases it to splendid advantage. It's a scintillating, upbeat number with a melody that quickly assimilated, powerfully sung, mainly in unison, with a lavish orchestral scoring that somehow doesn't seem out of place despite the thumping beat.
The single was not a success, but the B-side has appeared on multiple compilations over the years, and it has become a cult classic among enthusiasts of British psychedelia.
We've got to find a place to be on our own.
Before Kurt Cobain and company, there was already a band called Nirvana, and they were an excellent Baroque pop band with a penchant for great melodies. This was the group's 5th single, and both sides were featured on their 2nd album. The A-side was also the theme tune from a 1968 film called The Touchables.
All of us take it slow.
The New Musical Express wrote,
If you look back in past issues of the NME, you'll find that I have never failed to review Nirvana's discs favorably, and I see no reason for wavering from that policy now. For two lads, they always create a rich, full and flowing sound. The multi-tracked harmonies on this number waft around the room and completely engross the listener, while the thumping beat keeps the old toes tapping. Attractive material as well, and as this very recording is heavily featured in the new film, The Touchables, it must be in with a chance.
The B-side was another fantastic song.
What is it like on the flying trapeze sea? Walking in the sky, just like angels in the high.
Despite the quality of the single and the good reviews, the record didn't make the charts. Another highlight from November 1968 was this excellent track by Curiosity Shop. The group was formed in Liverpool in 1967, and this was their only single. The group moved to London in 1968 and achieved quite a bit of success in clubs such as the Marquee. The group must have caused quite a stir because even Paul McCartney went to see them a couple of times. Record Mirror wrote,
Curiosity Shop hail from Liverpool, made their debut at the famous Cavern 5 months ago, and have since not only won a large fan following, but have turned professional. Similar speed ensued when they met up with producer Pat Meehan Jr., who was so impressed that within 4 days he had the group in a studio to record Baby I Need You, which now appears on the Derham label.
I can hear crying, la 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 la, beside the railings of the Woodstock candy store.
Another good single which unfortunately went unnoticed was this 45 by a group called Turquoise. Record Mirror wrote,
Turquoise is the collective name of 4 young men from North London. A pretty well set out outfit. They have Tom Keelock, tour manager of the Rolling Stones, as manager, Nems as agents, and the Beatles Apple as their publishing company. They also have a fan club that informally includes the Kinks and the Small Faces. Their new record is Woodstock, out on Decca. Their approach on stage is to make sure that they're doing something all the time. There's a lot of instrument swapping and a lot of moving around so people don't have a chance to lose interest.
The single didn't manage to make the charts, but just like many tracks featured on this video, the song was rediscovered years later when it was included on multiple compilations of obscure British singles from the 60s. Blonde on Blonde were formed in South Wales in 1967, and this was their debut single. The single was well promoted in the press, with several ads appearing in most of the major music publications, but the single wasn't even reviewed, and it went completely unnoticed. Later in 1969, the group released an album called Contrasts, which has become a cult favourite among many enthusiasts of late 60s psychedelia and prog rock. After recording 2 more albums in 1970 and 1971, the group finally disbanded in 1972. Atlantis by Donovan became one of the biggest hits from November 1968. Penny Valentine wrote,
Atlantis, if you didn't know, was the great city that disappeared beneath the sea on a strange day. Donovan will tell you about it in his odd little speaking voice at the beginning. A very long-spoken introduction it is as well. Suddenly, it erupts in an odd sort of close singing about this girl probably being in Atlantis where he wants to be. It goes on with over-singing and a very impulsive let's all sing along with Donovan quality. I did as well. It's almost odd but still destined for the hit parade.
Atlantis became a worldwide success. It reached number 1 in the Netherlands and in Switzerland, while also reaching the top 5 in Austria, New Zealand, and West Germany. In the United States, it was initially released as the B-side to the song To Susan on the West Coast, Waiting, but was promoted to the A-side after receiving significant airplay, eventually reaching number 7 on the US Billboard Hot 100. In Britain, however, the single managed only a modest number 23 on the UK singles chart.
If you haven't heard this new song by the Foundations, you'll probably dance to it in clubs and discotheques this weekend.
Why do you fill me up, baby?
A video about November 1968 wouldn't be complete without mentioning this huge hit by the Foundations. Penny Valentine wrote,
I have to admit now that despite all their songs being roughly the same, I like the Foundations records. I think partially it's that they always have those few same notes that I like the sound of, creeping into their songs, and I suppose that's what gives them an easily identifiable sound. Anyway, those notes crop up again in this new song, which I was rather stunned to see that it was written by Tony Macaulay with Manfred Mann's lead singer Mike Dabo. The song runs into itself with brown piano and bongos and some nice Tamla breakups.
The single reached number 1 in Britain and number 3 in the States, and it became a top 10 hit in close to 15 countries. I hope you enjoyed this trip back to November 1968. See you next time.